Right, evening, guys. Thanks for joining us tonight. There's good numbers on here, so nice to see everyone interested in what Phil's about to deliver. So, yeah, just a few little bits. We're recording this for other people and for future use. So if everyone could generally stay on mute, please, just because mainly so that Phil, as the speaker, will be on the screen for the recording for the majority of the time. Any noise would put you on the screen. So, one thing I would say as well is use the chat function. Phil, if you maybe have chat open on the side of your screen, I'll do the same as well. And then if you've got any questions as we go along, just pop them in the box, and it might just jog Phil into going a little off script and trying to make it a bit interactive and bringing you in on the conversation. Otherwise, it gets a little bit, listening to one. I know being the presenter, it gets a bit tough on your own. So, but what Phil's going to do tonight is we do a lot of training with our coaches in the background, and various of our existing or long-serving coaches dip in on this, and Phil's sort of modified a presentation he does to our coaches, and he's sort of constantly modifying this over time as cycling within triathlon evolves, and it's definitely one of the, I would say, top presentations that our coaches get from time to time, especially new coaches coming on. So I'll hand you over to Phil to crack on with the presentation. Yeah, if we there's a few more just joined. If everyone can go to mute, and I'll let Phil get on with it. Phil, if you share your screen, you'll at least take over that.
Yep, I'll have a go. Oh, disabled. It says now. I've clicked on it. Yeah, go on if you can.
Now try again.
Yeah. Have you got me?
Yeah.
Do you like that from Liège, Bastogne Liège?
It's obviously for me, not you, though, isn't it?
Just for me, that was. They'd all been out all night. Right. Has the presentation slides come up now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, as Phil said, most of us are very diligent with doing our training regime. You know, we do what we're told, or we perhaps have our own plan to work off. We're not shy of working hard. We try to build our bodies and our fitness the best we can. But there are other ways to ride faster, and it's not all simply about trying harder. You might sometimes be frustrated when other people perhaps ride a faster time than you on a certain course or in a certain event, and you can be quite puzzled as to how that's actually happened. But what we're going to go through tonight is looking whether you're actually doing your very best across this bike leg and trying to minimize the time that you're out on the bike. So the pedaling harder we can take for granted, but there might well be some low-hanging fruit that you've not even considered that can help you to ride your bike faster. And most of the principles that we're talking about are probably equally appropriate to both time trialing on its own and the triathlon bike leg, but some of the principles are probably a little bit more specific to triathlon, and that way we can try and pick up on all these easy gains before we even start to worry about marginal gains. These things that become so popular since Dave Brailsford took over at Team Sky a number of years ago. So that's the main sort of theme of the talk, is let's prioritize where we should be spending our money and what factors we should be thinking about to get the most out of it. And we'll take the training for granted, really. So what we're not talking about really is training principles. We're not going to talk about any science to do with training the right way. We're not going to talk about physiology and biology of the body. We're not going to talk about supplements or aids, some of the nutrition stuff that we could consider, although notably SIS are going to talk to us at TTT midweek. So that's something else to keep your eye out for. But what we are going to sort of consider tonight is you as the rider and what you can do and what you should be considering. We'll also look at the bike. Obviously, that's one of the things, the key things. But perhaps of even more importance, we'll look at this interaction of the bike with the rider. And that's probably the biggest area that we're going to be considering this evening. And then to finish with, we will just talk a little bit about sort of strategizing for your key races and planning how to race your goal race to the best of your ability. Again, rather than perhaps just holding a high average power, that might not actually be the best way to get around the course. So if we start off with this slide and we look at the main things that are preventing us from riding our bike fast, gravity is quite an easy one to sort of conceptualize. It makes us heavy. Aerodynamic drag is often, referred to as wind resistance or air resistance. And that's the principal force that pushes against us as we try to ride fast. And we can often, even hear that in our ears. We get a sense of how much wind we're pushing through as we pedal forwards. And then one of the other key forms of resistance is rolling resistance. And this is, in basic terms, it's the friction between the tire and the floor or the ground that we're actually riding on. There are a couple of others. The other one, principal one being friction in the drivetrain. So obviously if we apply power to the pedals, but there's a lot of friction from the chain rings, the chain, the sprockets, and even to a very tiny degree in the bottom bracket of the bike, then we could be losing some of our power just trying to overcome that. So they're the main forms of resistance that we're going to sort of consider. But what I want to try to get across to you is how important aerodynamic drag is and how that is the principal force that we need to overcome when we're riding a bike forwards. So I've put the equation there for drag at the top, and that's more just to make me look clever, to be honest. But I don't fully understand the whole equation. But the reason I've put it up there is because it highlights the variables that we need to think about with regards to drag force. And FD there at the start of the equation is the drag force. And we ignore the actual equation itself, but P stands for air density. So the density of the air that we're riding through makes a difference to how much drag there's going to be. V is velocity, so that's just speed. So we could choose to ride slower and there'll be less drag, but that's not something we really want to do. So we're going to focus on trying not to do that one. And then CDA is a term that we'll come to terms with a little bit later. And that's to do with your drag as a bike and rider sort of complex. The A is for area. So that's basically the frontal area that you're pushing into the wind, the bit that the wind can see. And the coefficient of drag, the CD, is basically how sticky you are or how slippery you are in that wind. And we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail later. So as I say, drag is the most resistive force that we need to overcome. It's measured actually in grams, but what often happens is it gets converted to watts. So for every 50 grams of drag that we save or we add, that equates to about 6.5 watts. So when you see manufacturers and scientists talking about saving 10 watts here or 5 watts there, they've measured the grams of drag and then converted it. If we move on to some figures around it, if you were to ride your bike at lower than 9 miles per hour, then aerodynamic drag plays probably second fiddle to gravity. So if you're riding very slowly, as might happen if you're climbing a significant hill, gravity does predominate at that point. But once you get to 10 miles an hour and certainly past about 12 or 13 miles an hour, then most of the resistance to us moving forward becomes aerodynamic drag. So it does apply to most people riding in most situations. Once we get up to the lofty heights of about 30 miles an hour, which we might not do very often, about 90% of all the energy that we're putting into the bike is actually just to overcome that air resistance, with the remainder being the rolling resistance really of the tires on the ground. And if we think of what we could perhaps achieve quite easily is just a small 2% reduction in drag, well, again, this will become a bit more apparent when we talk through other figures later, but a 2% reduction in drag would probably save in the regions of about 30 seconds over a 25-mile time trial or the 40K bike leg of a standard distance triathlon. And something that we come across, I think perhaps as bike fitters and as coaches very often, is that people, particularly the novices and perhaps the slower riders, feel that drag isn't really that important because they're not at the pointy end of the field. But what we need to remember is that the flip side of riding fast is riding easy. So if we can make ourselves more slippery in the wind, we'll be able to ride at an easier pace if we want to and still travel at the same speed. So we ride at an easier effort level for the same speed. So for faster riders, drag is really important to consider because the resistance goes up exponentially. It's not a linear sort of increase. It goes up massively at higher speeds. So to get a little bit faster takes a massive amount more energy once you're already traveling fast. And for slower riders, although they don't tend to save as much, they're on the course a lot longer. And therefore, the savings are magnified by the longer time that they're on the course. So just a couple of examples that I wanted to show you on the next slide. Just again, it's a bit sort of daunting at first when I just hit you with loads of facts and figures. But if you were to ride a fairly sedate sort of 12.5 miles an hour, and that takes you about 75 watts of energy or power to do that, and you want to just increase by about 1.5 miles per hour, you probably need in the region of 20 watts extra. And if we want the same increase, but we're already traveling at 17 miles per hour, which is quite a common, riding pace for a lot of people, around 70 miles an hour, you've actually got to put a lot more energy in the pedals at that point. You've got to add over 30 watts to be able to get that same increase of 1.5 miles an hour. And you can see again how it goes even higher. If we're traveling at a fairly speedy, maybe top end race pace of sort of 22 miles an hour, and we're trying to get a bit more from our bike leg, just that 1.5 miles an hour increase is now going to take pretty much 50 watts extra. And that's not easy, is it? You can't add 50 watts without it taking a toll at some point. So that's where drag becomes really, really relevant. On the other example side, if we would take a 75 kilo athlete, they're pushing a fairly modest 150 watts on a 25-mile time trial, it would probably take them about 1 hour and 13 or 14 minutes. So it's just over 20 miles an hour there. If we could just reduce the drag of the rider and the bike by about 10 watts, which, as you'll see from some other examples, isn't much at all, really. It's quite easy to find 10 watts for a lot of people. They'd save around about 2 minutes or 2.5%. just by saving a few watts in drag there. Now, if we contrast that with somebody perhaps up at the pointy end of the race, same sort of weight of rider, but they're actually pushing out 300 watts, that time trial is going to take them quite considerably less, 15 to 20 minutes less. But that 10 watts of drag saving can still save them 40 seconds, which it isn't as much of a percentage. Excuse me again, but it's going to make a big difference to their result. I think this coughing is going to be quite common through this, unfortunately. And again, let's take it to the other end of the spectrum. Let's look at a heavier rider. Let's say they're perhaps a novice doing their first Ironman race. They're using a road bike and they're going to ride on the drops. And let's say they put out an average of 200 watts on a nice flat course. That's probably, 5 hours, 50 minutes of ride time. Were they just to clip on some tri bars, they'll save in the region of 50 minutes, 50 minutes, just improving that aerodynamic position, which, as you can see, that's a massive gain. That's one that, is a basic no-brainer. If we then added them a nice aero helmet instead of a road helmet, it's likely we can take off another good few minutes. And what's also important about that is it brings down the effort level because they're on the course for a lot less. So if we've now saved them around about an hour on the course, their stress score from that ride would drop by about 50 points. Now that means that they're much more likely to run to their potential or closer to their potential because they've basically expended less energy on the bike. Now, they could choose to ride a little harder because they're now an hour less on the course, and they might save a bit more if they ride a little harder, knowing that they're not going to be out there as long. So you can see how it starts to impact not only, people at the very pointy end of the race, but, average Joe and even the back of the packer, it can all benefit from simple aero sort of tips and tricks. And the graph from Aero Coach just really illustrates that, how you've got your standard position on the drops, and then you've got the addition of the aero bars and how that can save you watts. And that's just an illustration, basically, if you want some figures, some figures on it. This was, I did an aero test session in the wind tunnel, the Boardman wind tunnel, with Zav Disley of Aero Coach a few years back now. And this was just to highlight that point, really. If you just look at the notes at the bottom, if I ride my TT bike, but sat kind of upright on the base bars, perhaps as if I'm climbing a hill, that sort of position, I lose 70 watts in aerodynamic drag versus my standard TT position, not an optimized TT position, but 73 watts was the difference. So if I want to travel at the same speed sat on the base bars, I've got to add 73 watts of extra power to maintain the speed. Whereas I can obviously just take the option of sort of bending over, put my elbows down on the cups, and then I can ride with 70 watts less power for the same speed. Now, that's based on traveling at nearly 30 miles an hour. which is probably unrealistic. But even at a slower pace of around about 19 miles an hour, which again is much more realistic, we're still saving quite a bit, as you can see there. So just finishing up on the sort of the variables that we need to think about with drag. Some of them, as we've mentioned, are largely uncontrollable. You know, air density is related to the temperature, the humidity, the altitude that we're at, and obviously we can be battling some days against the wind direction and the speed of the wind, but we can largely class them as uncontrollable. They're going to be whatever they're going to be on our chosen race. But on the controllable sides of things, we can, as I say, we can adjust our speed, but we don't really want to ride slower just to reduce the air resistance. We want to ride faster, if anything. So the biggest part of that equation that we can alter is the CD, the coefficient of drag, which, as I say, is how sticky or slippery we are, us and the bike, and how much turbulence is caused by us and the bike. And the A, the area, which is mainly, it's that frontal area. If you were to set a camera up in front of yourself on your TT bike, it's that the camera can see. It's how big that area is, and you can measure that if you want to. So I've just realized I can't see any comments on this screen, so let me just flick across. No comments yet. Okay, so now this, I think it's important to say that, you know, when we compare ourselves perhaps to pro cyclists, we see a lot of data, and when we've been racing on Zwift and the like, a lot of what we tend to end up talking about is watts per kilogram, and it's our power at threshold, and it's then divided by our weight in kilograms. And that is still quite important, and it does allow us to compare ourselves and perhaps make improvements. You know, if we can lose a bit of body weight and gain a bit of power, we should be a better cyclist. Excuse me. We should be a better cyclist. But what's more important is really our watts per unit of CDA. Sorry about that. If we think about the drag, it is largely you as the rider that is sort of most to blame, or can have the biggest influence on your drag. If you upgrade your bike, spend on some fancy components, they can only improve about the 20% side of the equation, unless they improve your position on the bike. And that's something that I will come back to again later. Most of the upgrades we make are prioritized really by how well they fit the bike to us, or how well we can improve our position. They're not often for the sort of inherent benefits of the components themselves. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. So we really need to think about us rather than the bike. And mainly here, this really just brings us on to that concept of thinking about your clothing and your position and your helmet. So these are just some images of myself over the years, just not really, you know, racing at a decent level, but not really understanding aerodynamics previously. The left-hand side is the earliest position, the middle is a few years ago, and I think the right-hand side is about 3 years ago now. And it's just to illustrate that, you know, you can buy the right bike, you can get in a decent position, but you're probably still far from optimized on that bike. And you can see on the upper left one, I'm still kind of quite broad on the bike. My head's quite high, shoulders are kind of broad and far apart, my arms are far apart. I'm not particularly low down, etc. You can see that whilst it's on a TT bike, it's not an optimal position. And then that has been kind of optimized over the years, and I've moved on since the position that's on the far side and the right. But that was, again, much narrower, still quite tall, so I can keep an open hip angle and still produce some power. Sorry. But the wind is now going to see less of me. That's basically what's going on here. We're getting less frontal area. So if we think about where we could spend our money, and we could look at kind of putting them into a bit of a sort of hierarchy, we could invest in a bike frame, a new bike. We could upgrade the components, get some new clothing, maybe pay for a bike fit. And I don't want you to look at it top down like that. What I really want you to think of it is more like bottom up. Unless you've got a bike that really is unsuitable, we should probably be thinking about the bike fit first, then the clothing, maybe looking at component upgrades as necessary, and then a new bike, a new frame, maybe even new wheels can come at that top end of the pyramid. But there's things we can do lower down, and again, I'll show you why I think it's that way around. So when we're looking at fitting a bike, we are trying to get this sort of balance of, you know, the optimal bike, the optimal position of the rider, able to remain comfortable, still produce power, still be able to ride fast, you know, etc. What we've got to bear in mind is that bikes now are hugely adjustable, almost infinitely, infinitely adjustable. And the human body can change over time. If we put things in place, we get used to the position. Sorry, I'll take a second. Apologies.
Yeah. Gonna go on my bike, I think.
You're surviving, Phil.
Yeah, it's just a tickle, as it would be.
Yeah, luckily I've not got that part of it. So take your time. I'm sure everyone's all right for 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about the principles of a bike fit, these are probably some of the things that we're considering. You know, that for a triathlete particular, we've got to be able to run off the bike, and we need to consider that when we're setting somebody up. We're not necessarily looking for the lowest, tightest position, because you might then not be able to run off that bike very well at all. We obviously want it to be aerodynamic. We want to be able to put the power down in that position, particularly for longer races. We want it to be comfortable. Maybe we can tolerate a certain level of discomfort, and for shorter races, maybe we can tolerate a bit more discomfort. And then we need to, you know, take into account the budget as well. So some changes, you know, to do with perhaps a stem and some arm cups and, you know, a couple of TT bars or whatever, there might be a, you know, largely fairly cheap end of the spectrum. But if we're talking about changing bikes and other components and looking at some of these custom fit front end options, it could run to a lot of money. So again, we can do that, but we need to prioritize where that athlete is, what sort of benefits they're looking for, really. And we can guide them then as to which of these principles we're going to bias the bike fit and the components towards. And again, that's something the guys at Total Training's Bike Fit service can really help with. When we are looking at moving into an aerodynamic position, so we're looking at coming a bit more narrow, we're going to bend over lower so that the hip angle, the front of the hip gets closed up, gets narrower. It will affect your ability to produce power. Everybody pretty much will produce less power when in the TT position than when in the standard road bike position. We should be aiming, everybody I think should be under 10%. So if your FTP was 250 watts, you should be able to ride at 225 or above at threshold again in that position. So I think that's something that's important. If you're outside of that, we'd need to look at the position, and we'd also need to just see whether you need to do some training in that position to get used to it, or perhaps do some off bike work for flexibility or strength to help you produce the power in that position. But even if we lose a few watts, you know, 10 or 20 watts of power get lost, as I showed earlier, for me, I'm going to save around 40, 50 watts riding at 20 odd mile an hour just by getting on those bars. So there's still a net gain. We just have to then get better at riding in that position, really. Obviously, the main thing that a bike fitter is going to adjust is the position of the saddle and the bars and the pedals. It's all about those contact points, that triangle that's made between the three contact points. Largely speaking, what your frame and seat post and chain stays and seat stays and forks are doing between that doesn't really matter, as long as we get the ratio, the relationship of those key points sorted for you. And then we've got to just turn it into the training side of things, and you've got to get used to it. If we need to change things quite drastically, it might be better to make incremental changes. You know, go away, try a certain position for 6 weeks, and then maybe lower it or tighten it up and make other. If you're making quite big changes, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that all in one go, because it could lead to injury if you're not used to it. This photo I quite like, because it's obviously a very extreme position, but a novice could look at that and go, wow, that's super aerodynamic. Is that's probably what we're trying to achieve. That might be what you're trying to achieve if you're a pro level cyclist, a specialist in a time trial, looking to win the national championships over a short time trial course in flat conditions with a motorbike telling you which way to go and no traffic on the road, good road surface with no potholes. Then maybe that position is one we're after. But I think you'll probably agree that most of those conditions I've just stipulated, we're never going to ever ride in that sort of event. So when we're looking again at how to prioritize what we want, the position needs to be comfortable enough that it's sustainable for the event. If you're wriggling, if you're wriggling about, changing position quite regularly, having to stretch, all that is lost time, and it's largely going to affect your time more than this aggressive position you've tried to get into. If you're inflexible or just simply not able to hold this new position, then that's important. And again, most bike fitters will do some off the bike assessment to check your hip range of motion, for instance, your lower back range of motion, your hamstring flexibility, etc., to check that you can actually achieve some of the positions that they're thinking of putting you into. If you've got a history of injury, then that would be important, because we might need to take that into account. And again, we've got to be mindful that we're aiming to run off the bike. So my final word on that really is just be a little bit cautious about some of the photos that you see on social media, some of the figures that you might see on social media, because a lot of it's led by marketing, publicity. And again, some of it is done in a wind tunnel, not a real world riding condition. When we're setting people up for triathlon and looking for them to have a good leg of the bike ready to run in the best position they can be, it doesn't necessarily mean we're looking for these extreme low figures that you see in a wind tunnel. Although if you're able to achieve those, then that's great as well. So let's move on a step. Picture of Phil there from a few years ago, but just illustrating that even if we don't make much change to the bike, we can actually improve our profile into the wind by trying to be a bit more aware of our position and the shape of our body when we're riding the TT bike. So if we presume we've got somebody already on a TT bike or on a road bike with tri-bars, and we want to get them optimally positioned without tinkering with anything, we could try some training drills. We could make them aware of their body position and how they can become a bit smaller in the wind and how this can affect their bike time. And then that would need practice then, whether it's practice with some sort of camera setup or a mirror or etc. It's just, or perhaps we could give them feedback as to where the nose should be or what the helmet should feel like on the head, etc. We can look into that. So the main thing that we can alter is your head and shoulder position. There's not much we can change on the saddle because you've got to sit on the saddle, so you can move forwards and backwards, but the bit we really want to think about in training is how we hold our head, shoulders and arms into the wind. So if you think about maybe yourself sat as you are now there, if you're relaxed and your shoulders are down, you are again quite broad. If you shrug upwards as if you're shrugging your shoulders to your ears, you are naturally more narrow, because as you shrug up and your traps pull your shoulders up, you become a little bit more narrow. Now, again, you can't necessarily do that over a whole Ironman, because you'd probably end up with a lot of neck pain and headaches, but it just shows you how you can affect your body position by shrugging your your arms to your ears, not your ears to your arms. I think you'd be a bit unusual if you could do that, to be honest. The next thing is we need to, so that's like an active thing. You're not just sitting there passively leaning on the bars. You are actively adopting a position. Boydie, you might want to go on camera off, unless you want to show everybody all your dancing there. The other thing is your head. So it's often a bit more aerodynamic if we can actually get our head out of the wind. Many good time trialists, if you see them sort of from behind, you can't actually see the head, because it's lower and kind of enveloped in the outline or the silhouette of the body. So if we can bring our head down and perhaps push the chin forward, sometimes it's described as this sort of turtle position, pushing your chin forwards, then that could be a useful cue, really. But where you can see the photo with Phil, if you can minimize that gap from sort of mouth to forearms or nose to thumbs, that can help really bring the head down. And again, that can save quite a lot of wattage. It can really save on the aerodynamic side of things, but it's an active position. You have to hold that position, and it does take training. One of the things I quite like is to actually get people to push their elbows into the cups and pull up to use the biceps a little bit. So if you imagine pushing your elbows down and out into the cups of the elbow pads, and at the same time sort of pulling up with your fingers against the extensions, you'll actually engage your biceps a little bit, and it often offloads your triceps, because at the back of your arm, they're the things taking your body weight throughout the whole bike leg. I quite like to do it now and again. It's just pull up on the bars as if you're doing like a little bit of a bicep curl. That offloads your tricep and takes away a little bit of the strain. And also it helps you to bring your nose lower, because you're actively sort of pulling in. Now, again, I'm not saying you sort of pull down as hard as you can for the whole length of your bike, but it's just these little things as cues that can help you hold a good position. And then the difficulty then is seeing up the road. And the reason that a lot of people then have to sort of lift their head up every 5 seconds is to try to see where they're going. It is of utmost safety that we don't ride head down, obviously. So all of our bike fits will be with that in mind, that we're not looking for a head down position. So what you're going to have to do is actually try to hold your head low and then use your eyeballs to do the work of looking forwards, which again, at first will cause a bit of strain, and it's another additional little bit of discomfort that we've got to try to work through and deal with, perhaps, but nothing extreme. I'm not asking you to lift them out of your head. Again, this was a still image of my testing in the wind tunnel. And if you look at the before and after, at first, apart from a different helmet, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, there's not really any difference there. And there isn't huge difference, but this is just to show you how some subtle differences can change things. So the main difference here, apart from the different helmet, is my elbows have been slid backwards slightly on the elbow cup. So I'm slightly more at a 90-degree arm position onto the elbow pad. And I'm actively pulling my face down to try to almost get it parallel with my forearms. So that's what's changed mainly. The hip angles are roughly kind of the same. The back of the bike hasn't really changed much. And to give you an example there, that saved 9 watts, so almost 10 watts. Partly from the helmet, partly from just tucking in a little bit more. And that brought my CDA, as you can see, top left, the number to under 0.2. And for somebody who's 6'1" with long arms and legs, that's a pretty good number, to be honest. It's certainly nowhere near the best, but for my height and limb length, it's a pretty good number. Now, in the run notes, you can read that little bit extra. And that was if I really pulled my head down to an uncomfortable position, which maybe I could only do for a few minutes, it actually saved another 5 watts. Now, again, maybe you'd consider doing that on a shorter distance race. Maybe you'd do that into a headwind just to make life a little easier on the difficult section of the course. So I'm not saying you would look to do that the whole time, but that slide was mainly just to illustrate when you take already a good position, you can tinker with it, not make massive gains. But if I was to save around about 14-15 watts with an optimal position for a few minutes, that could be the difference, you know, in a position or two on a finished board, really. So let's talk about some of, well, I'll tell you what, before I do that, let me just check. Is there any questions? Does anybody want to, what have we got? Yeah, exactly. So on the bike, the comment that we still want a nice one. Yeah, I'm going to talk about purely the performance gains, but when you buy anything, God, you want it to look nice. You've got to like the look of it. You know, we are, you know, at the end of the day, we're amateurs who have to buy our own kit most of the time. You want something that you want to get out and ride. So God, yeah, you want to open the garage door and go, yeah, that's a sexy bike. Let's get it out and get it done. Yeah, so I totally take that point, and it's not a silly point. Disc wheel, I'm going to come on to that as well. That's the next one. When we're talking about components, disc wheels are fast. And most people, most of the time, would benefit from using one. And we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a second. Any more questions before I move on? Otherwise, we're going to talk about some of the components, probably the bit that you were expecting we'd talk about most, really. Width between elbows, as in, is narrower better? Or generally speaking, again, this is I suppose we've got compromises to be made. It's likely, I'll do a bit of demo, sort of, if you can still see me. If you're narrow with a higher hand position, this will act like a fairing. So as the wind comes towards you, it's almost like you've got a motorbike with a screen or a fairing around it, and it's going to help to guide the wind around your head and your body. There was an argument that really, if you go narrower than your shoulders, there's probably not much point, because the wind's still gonna hit you because your shoulders are this wide. I don't think that really adds up. I think narrower is generally better, and then this higher hand position again can be useful. I'm going to go on to that again, and that's going to help the air to pass around you and some other things as well. So I don't think they necessarily have to be touching. You do see touching. And I ride with my touching, but I don't think we necessarily need to go there. And certainly if we're moving with a more novice athlete, we don't want to ram them straight into this forearm touching position, because the front end of the bike will feel very twitchy, especially if in a crosswind. So yeah, there's definitely some confidence and bike control issues. You'll have less aero drag if your feet are at 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock on the clock, on the cranks. Yeah. Okay. So thinking about some of the upgrades, as I've said, what I think we need to prioritize is the upgrades that will reduce drag first and mostly. And of those, we've obviously got a few there that I've listed. Some of them are going to cost you a lot, unfortunately, relatively speaking, and some of them won't cost much at all. Again, there's nothing in triathlon that's dead cheap, but it costs you a lot less. So we could look at it as like what's saved per cost. I've not gone into the facts and figures, but I've just stuck some pound signs on. I think if you change your frame, it's going to cost a lot. New frames now are £4,000 to £6,000 for a top end TT frame. That's just a frame. And it's not on its own, it's not likely to save you much at all. It might not even be better than the bike that you're currently riding, perhaps. The TT bars, again, changing the front end of the bike doesn't cost that much, a couple of £100 probably, and we can get you into a much better position. Wheels, yes, there are aerodynamic savings, but once you've got deep section wheels, the upgrade costs, again, are quite high for very little kickback. So yeah, if you've not got any decent wheels at all, they're probably worth investing in, but there might be other areas you want to look at first. For us triathletes, we need to think about the aerodynamicness and the ease of access of our nutrient storage. And then the clothing is a big one. If we're going to take 80% of the drag, what we wear is massively important. So maybe we should invest more earnestly in our tri suit or skin suit than in the bike, the sexy carbon stuff. The other form of resistance that we need to be concerned about, and again, doesn't cost too much really when we're looking at this, is rolling resistance. Again, I'll go through this in more detail, but that's to do with the tires that we choose, the tire pressure that we run, which doesn't cost anything. We just got to adhere to some guidelines, and then the tubes, or whether we go tubeless. So, and again, that doesn't cost you much in the scheme of things either. So we'll run through that. So they're no brainers again, really, because there's savings to be had and the costs are relatively low. And then the drivetrain friction that I mentioned. And this, again, some simple things which don't cost much are definitely worth doing. Some more expensive stuff, again, it's starting to fall into the marginal gain sort of ballpark, but they'll be heavily marketed. So we might be seeing a lot of this on social media and other forms of platform. So it's you've got to decide where to put your money. This would be my guide, would be invest in things that are going to position you better on the bike. If they make you more slippery in the wind and less sticky, then that's going to make you ride a lot faster for no extra effort. It's just where to spend your money. And again, depending on budget, there'll be various options with that. But basically, none of us should be wearing baggy, textured clothing that doesn't fit us very tightly. And that's great, because I think probably everybody on the call loves riding in lycra. That's part of the reason for doing triathlon, isn't it? Wearing some bright lycra stuff. And then if those components themselves, so if we're investing in something to do with the bike, if they are more aerodynamic than what we have in their own right, or it reduces the drivetrain friction, or it reduces the rolling resistance, then yeah, maybe we should buy them, but only if we've addressed the top two first. If they're lighter, Yes, I mean we're always marketed, things are marketed as being lighter, disc wheels a bit lighter than the last one, a frame a little bit lighter than the last one, etc., etc. As we've said though, gravity is not as big an issue as we perhaps think it is for all but the most extreme races. If you're going to do Alpe d'Huez triathlon, by all means, start drilling holes in all your components and making them lighter. But for races that start and finish at the same altitude, aerodynamics is still by far the biggest factor that you need to consider. There was a mention of adding 2 kilos, so like 2 and a bit full water bottles to your bike at the start of Ironman Lanzarote would only add 2 to 3 minutes to your time if you maintain that extra weight all the way around. And that wouldn't happen, but it's just to show you that over an extremely hilly, long bike ride, and adding 2 kilos sounds like quite a lot. Your bike would feel really quite heavy, but it's only 2 or 3 minutes. It's not as big as you would perhaps think. There are drag effects that are would outweigh that, by far. And then obviously, like we've said, we do want to buy some components that we really want to spend our money on. If it looks cool, you think it's sexy, it makes you want to ride your bike more, you think your friends will admire it, then yeah, of course, with a disc wheel, that wump noise that it makes, that's half the point of getting one, isn't it? It just sounds cool when you ride past people. It's a shame you can't hear it more, actually. I always find when I'm riding, you don't hear it as much as the people who you're passing do, but as long as they hear it, it's kind of half the battle, isn't it? So that would be my order of where to think about spending your money. But unfortunately, it might not quite be where you really want to spend your money, because it's likely that the bottom two, getting things that are marketed as lighter or look really cool, that's where you're perhaps drawn to spending your money. So let's start with the clothing. I think this is a big issue. Cam Worth was interviewed, and he said that basically if he had a pot of money to spend, he'd spend about 80% of his money on his sort of clothing, his helmet, his skin suit, and he wouldn't spend much on the bike. So again, that just alludes to the fact that people are recognizing that it's the rider that hits the most amount of wind. So some of the principles here, we know that Lycra pretty much across the board is less sticky than skin. So cover up as much as you can. So what that means is if you're riding a time trial, a long sleeve skin suit is going to be a little bit faster than a short sleeve skin suit. For people who do triathlon, as has become a lot more popular now, the short sleeved tri suits should be faster than a vest top, because you're showing less skin. And even if you were to shave that skin, we know shaved skin is generally faster than hairier skin because of the airflow. You're still slower than when you're covered in Lycra. And then obviously the top end suits tend to be manufactured with seams in certain places so they don't hit the wind. They'll obviously perhaps be manufactured of slightly better quality material. And what's crucial is that they'll put the so-called strips or textured material in the areas that hit the wind. Particularly, so on this rider, you can see with the Endura suit on, how the shoulder and arm and even the side panel of the body are all textured. And basically, without going into too much of the physics, it disturbs the boundary level of air, so that layer of air that's most closely attached to the skin or to the rider, it can't attach as much. So when it peels off, when it passes his bum and comes to the saddle area, it's not going to drag as much. It's not going to suck back as much because it's not gripping him as much because of that textured area at the front of the suit. So you'll see various types. You'll see stripes and strips and sort of bobbles and dimples and these look like sort of checks or something. So they're done in different ways. Each manufacturer is going to try and find a niche to be able to market it and sell it. But basically, these strips are quite common in the upper end suits. And obviously, the main thing though is it needs to be tight fitting. And I think the thing to think about here is perhaps if the weather's quite bad and you're tempted to put a jacket on for a race or a gilet, maybe there could be an option that's a little bit more aerodynamic, maybe putting something down your TT suit or down your tri suit, perhaps like a foil blanket that they give out, maybe a folded up foil blanket to keep your chest warm, maybe a bin bag. You do see it. We saw it at Outlaw a couple of years ago when the race was freezing cold. And there's options there. Maybe we can keep it a little bit more aero by actually putting things inside the suit rather than adding baggy, flappy material on top. So again, just a little bit of food for thought there if you're getting getting to race in a very cold race. I know I made a huge mistake at Ironman UK in 2015. It was really horrible weather, and I bought a new jacket the day before because I was scared I was going to be frozen to death. And it got really hot halfway through. Tried to unzip it, couldn't get the zip open at the bottom, so rode the last half of the ride with the jacket on and it flapping and catching a massive amount of wind in the front. But you live and learn, don't you? You make mistakes. Hopefully you guys won't make the same mistakes. Another example of the clothing side of it is these calf guards, and I think the novice would perhaps look at them and think they're to do with compression of the calf. You know, calf guards often came about from brands like 2XU and Compress Sport to compress the vessels and the muscles in the calves and help you run better and with less pain and soreness and help the blood flow. But then these came about, and to the novice, they look the same, but essentially these don't really compress your calf. There's most of the manufacturers now have a version of these. These are Aero Coach's no pins calf guards, and basically they're a simple lycra, but the two strips you can see that run just either side of your shin bone, again, they disrupt the airflow as it comes over your shin. And as you can see there, when you look at a shaved bare leg, they test quite a bit faster. And again, you're probably looking, I don't know, about a 30 pound investment, 40 pound maybe. And that could save you about 6 watts. Now, again, if you're looking to say, if you're at that, I'm not saying everybody should be wearing these, but 6 watts extra power on your Ironman would take a lot of effort over 5 hours. But 6 watts for the good, just by putting some things on your legs, it's not that difficult, is it? Now, we don't know everybody would make that exact saving, but we do know that across the board, these socks will save you something. Exactly how much, it's always difficult to say, but they will save you something. What's next? Okay, pointy helmets. We look like idiots, unfortunately, when we use the pointy helmets, but luckily most of them are not as pointy as they used to be. The long tail helmets have pretty much gone out of fashion. What we can say is there is no fastest helmet. It largely depends on your position on the bike and your kind of body structure, the width of your shoulders, etc., etc. Different helmets are going to interact differently depending on you and your position and what you do with your head and how big your shoulders are, etc., etc. So there's lots of variability. But if we look at some generalizations, if somebody went from like a standard vented, road helmet to an aero road helmet, you'd probably save 5 to 10 watts. So one of these ones that the sprinters wear in the Tour de France, which doesn't have any vents in it, but still looks like a road helmet. If you then move to a TT helmet, you probably save another 5 to 10 watts. Now, if you're already in a decent aero helmet and you're thinking about moving to a different one, it is quite difficult. It is quite difficult. You can look at it, you can go to the wind tunnel and stuff like that, but you'd have to invest quite a lot of money to know the difference between the helmets. When I went to that session that I've alluded to, I found a 5 watt difference between the 3 helmets that I chose. The reason I went mostly for the Casque Mistral was that was the one that penalized me the least if I got sloppy. So all of them were roughly the same. In fact, the Laser Wasp with the long tail at the back was the quickest if I held my perfect position. But with a long tail helmet, as soon as you wriggle about, that tail is not helping you at all. And in fact, it's probably dragging you backwards. So shorter tail helmets have become more and more popular. This was a screenshot from Global Cycling Network from GCN, just showing the effect of a TT helmet. This is, you can sort of see the picture behind. This is Ollie, one of the presenters, stuck him on his road bike with an aero helmet on. And you can see at slower speeds, it doesn't save him that much. It's still 6 watts, but it's not huge. And then at faster race speeds, you can see where the TT helmet sort of starts to come into its own again. Again, don't focus on those figures as being hard and fast, but they just give you a flavor as to what sort of savings you could expect from an aero helmet. And again, aero helmets, not a massive investment in money if you're going to buy a helmet anyway, and there's definitely time savings to be had for everybody there. But why do they work? Well, The main reason they work is they cover your ears up, so your ears are not going to cause turbulent airflow. If you've got a good pair of wing nuts, then an aero helmet is probably a great choice for you. They tend to be much wider. They look bigger. They look quite cumbersome, really. But what they do then is they smooth the airflow out over your back and your shoulders. So, and you might have seen from the time trial in the Tour de France 3 days ago, the helmets are getting even bigger. The visors are now looking massive. And although you might think that's going to be slower because that's going to hit more air, if that then has a positive downstream effect of making it much less sticky to your back and your shoulders, then it's going to be a net gain. And it seems to be that the helmets are going in that sort of direction. They'll normally have enough of a tail that they fill the gap between your head and the back of your neck area, but they're not now tending to be the very long tails. They won't generally have many vents or any vents, because again, anywhere the air can get into is going to cause drag. And again, broadly speaking, the integrated visor is likely to direct that airflow around your face a little bit better. So it's probably going to be faster. But there are instances where people test in the tunnel and they're faster without the visor. So unfortunately, we can't say for certain. Here we go. Same as I can see Dave Mantle on my picture. This is for Dave. You can see here that if you test road helmets against a baldy head, they are not as fast. Your most aerodynamic lid choice would be no lid, all right? But it's not safe, is it? It's not safe. Where you can see the big benefit is how the TT helmet top left is causing a lot less drag if we used a bald head as a standard point. The problem is that scale up the left is the ambient temperature of the face and the head. And you can see how much heat can build up inside an aero helmet. So there is a trade-off of this aerodynamic benefit, and that's because it's so enclosed, your perception of effort can go up in a very hot, humid environment. And that's sometimes why you see some of the pros perhaps opting for more less aero helmets in places like Kona or maybe Cozumel and some of these really hot races, or, sort of Philippines and Malaysia. But for most of us, that's the heat buildup is not that severe. It will make you a little bit more uncomfortable, but it's not something you need to be too worried about. Any questions on clothing? I'll just come and check that before we move on. Then we're on to the bike proper, really. The calf guards, they don't really affect the run. They shouldn't have any perceivable effect on cramp, because whilst it's tight lycra, it's not graduated. So there's not more compression at the lower end of the calf and less compression behind the knee. It's not going to massage. It's not going to stop the impact so much. So I don't think it's going to affect cramp in any perceivable way. It certainly shouldn't make it worse, though. I mean, there's a slight chance it could help. Flappy race belts. Probably the best option is a no pins belt, where you slide the race number into a plastic wallet that's already attached to the belt, and that tends to keep it. It can still flap about at the back a little bit, but it adds a little bit of weight to it, and it keeps it from catching the wind in a great amount. The only problem with the no pins belt is it doesn't have any loops for gels and stuff like that. So you perhaps need a race suit that's already got pockets in. A lot of them do have, but yeah, you can't really store gels in it. Unfortunately, most races still require us to use a race belt. There are the odd races where we don't have to use them on the bike. And if you don't have to use them on the bike, don't use them. Although I will say, Zav Disley told me that they tried to make somebody's race number look like an aerofoil on the bum. So with the kind of like a dome shape coming off the bum to try and act as like a spoiler on the back of a car. And it did make them more aero by a couple of watts. But whether you could actually make that happen in a race, I doubt it. Okay, so moving on to the bike. Frames have obviously changed a lot over the years. We've gone from these sort of round tubes to more aerofoil shapes. We've obviously now got integrated systems. We've gone from road bikes to specialized, dedicated time trial bikes with different geometry. And that's obviously made things, a lot faster. Things have sped up because of that. But now, when we're looking at in the market for decent bikes and decent time trial bikes, there aren't many bad bikes, really speaking, on their own. The Airfoil tubes, definitely faster. So we've seen this in aero road bikes, you know, the Giant Propel versus their TCR, the Scott Foil versus the Scott Addict. There's one often seen as a climbing bike because they've reduced the weight right down to the UCI minimum. And then the one with thicker tubes is a little bit heavier, but it's seen as more aerodynamic because of these profiles that they used, which are like used in aeronautics. It's called a NACA profile. And that's this wing shape, this teardrop shape, which have been shown time and time again to be the fastest shapes in the wind. And that's what we've used right up to the regulations. And obviously, if you're bound by UCI regulations, it's a little bit more difficult. But within triathlon, that's why you see these weird and wacky bikes now, because it's like a testing ground for people to try out some new kit and new choices. Again, the main thing to think about is, how does the bike integrate with both the rider? You know, it could be great and it might test really well in a wind tunnel on its own, but what is it like when a rider's on top of it and moving the legs around? It could be a different ball game. And that's now what we're seeing with some of these bikes with the wider forks at the front, you know, like the Hope bike in the Olympics, the new Cadex bike that Blumenfeld rode. They've started to bring the forks away from the wheel, because there's aerodynamic benefits to be had there, and maybe then they shield the shins of the rider because they're in that same plane as they hit the wind. So there's different ways of looking at it, but bikes can sometimes test better or worse when they've got a rider on them. And then obviously the wheels have become a lot more integrated. If you look at the picture at the bottom, how the cutout of the seat tube now sort of matches the rear wheel, and that shields the rear wheel from the wind, and again that makes a big difference. So technology's definitely moved on. But between the top bikes now, you can probably go for what suits your budget and what is adaptable and adjustable. And that's the last point, really. When we are changing bikes or buying bikes, we've got to make sure we get the appropriate size. We've got to make it adjustable and adaptable and easy to do so for very little cost for the bike fitter or the bike shop. And as triathletes, maybe we want to think about storage options as well. You know, you might not be going for a top end TT bike with all the integration built in, but you need to think about when you're purchasing it, where are you going to store your gels? What bottle system are you going to use? Because it might then affect the componentry that you buy and you choose as well. So these are the things to think about without just going out for that nice new pink shiny one or whatever it is that's caught your eye. A little bit of data regarding that. Again, this was just pinched from that GCN video that was online on YouTube. If you take a rider, and again, this is Ollie, one of the presenters, you can just about see him on the left with his standard road bike clothing on with a helmet. And what they did at first was clip on some TT bars. And at first they put them in the horizontal, the more standard position. And then they put them in what they've called vertical, but it's that upward facing angle, not fully vertical. That's what he's got on the picture there on the left. And you can see that just putting the TT bars on saves quite a bit. You know, at the faster speeds, it's saving 80 watts, which was similar to myself, saving about 73 watts when I went from a TT position to sitting up on the base bars. When they then angled them upwards, and he was again using his forearms perhaps as a little bit of a furring for the wind to hit, he saved even more. And you can see the order of the numbers there. He's saving 100 watts now from riding on his drops to riding on his TT bars, 100 watts, which is really, really quite a lot, isn't it? Again, if we look on the right-hand side, he's got his standard clothing on, and now we compare it from his TT bike. So the top figures are what he saves on his TT bike, and the bottom figures are the same ones as on the left. It's what he saved on his tri bike, on his road bike with tri bars. So you can see the TT bike at slower speeds doesn't really add in very much at all. It's 1 watt. It's almost negligible, really. There could be error of testing inbuilt with that. So again, this might impact what we would advise, you know, newer people to the sport, people who are not likely to ride the bike so fast. Then if you're riding at sort of 17 miles an hour average for a race, maybe sticking with your road bike and adding the TT bars is the way to go, and just optimize that bike for you. It's going to save you money. Obviously, if you want the TT bike, that's absolutely fine. If we're riding a lot faster, then the gains start to become a bit more apparent there, you see. But again, it's not as much as you'd think. You know, the difference for upgrading to a TT bike is not as much in itself as you would think compared to a reasonably good position on a road bike with the clip-on bars. So when we're talking about the front end, there's obviously tons and tons of adjustability. I think the manufacturers are getting better at this of the bikes, and now the aftermarket guys like Aero Coach, Drag to Zero, Watch Shop, Kismet, and the like. They've given us so many options for changing the front end. Again, I'm going to come on to now what I think again is the main things to think about. These components in their own right are likely to be fairly similarly aerodynamic to each other. But what's important, and when we look at the pictures here as well, is what they allow the rider to do. So if we change the position of the elbows and the forearms, and that allows you to drop your head lower because it's reducing some of the stress across your shoulders and your back. And I find particularly that it does do this. Your head is then out with the wind, and your head is this massive golf ball sat hitting the wind. So your head makes a big, big difference. And you can see Chris on his pictures on the bottom there. He's obviously looking quite low down on that one, on the left at the bottom, but his head is sheltered. And I find that when your forearms are pointing a bit more vertically, you can allow your head to drop down with a bit less effort. It's also said that that position where you can see Chris's sort of visor, his nose and his mouth is almost parallel to his forearms. That tests quite quickly in the wind tunnel as well. So that sort of position is kind of optimal. And then you look at the back of the helmet, how it fits with the streamline of his upper back. So you can see just from the aesthetics why that looks quite fast and quite good. The top left picture was just a Google image just to show that this guy's obviously slammed his stem down at the front. He's very low, but he's holding his head right up high. You know, sometimes that lower position and the horizontal forearms is less aerodynamic for a lot of people. Now, people might throw at me, well, Frodeno rides a bit like that, and Keenly, and they're two of the best riders in the sport, and they are, but they managed to do it with a low head position as well. So maybe it's a flexibility issue there, or something related to sort of body geometry in the upper limbs and the neck and the shoulders. So no, I will agree with that. And they've obviously tested that in the wind tunnel. But I would say for most people, most of the time, a higher hands position, allowing a lower head position and acting a bit like a fairing at the front is the better way to go. And if your components that you choose allow you to do that, it's likely you'll go quicker. If we think about things like the deep-sided elbow cups, you know, the elbow pads that have a high rise on both sides, they should help you stay locked in position and keep you more comfortable, and you can kind of rest into them a little bit. So I think they might be a useful addition. And then, you know, if we look at the bars that now support the forearm, some of them obviously 3D printed, but a lot of them from Drag to Zero and Aero Coach and Watch Shop, they just kind of have some foam padding that matches the shape and the contour of your forearm. That's going to give you a little bit more to lean on, which might make you more comfortable. The fact that the wind can't get in and around the poles, the ski poles, there's probably a marginal gain there of a watt or maybe 2 watts, but I wouldn't purchase them for that reason. I'd be looking at them for comfort or for bringing the hands up a bit higher. That would definitely be an improvement. I've said all that, yeah. The other one is, generally speaking, if you use the guy's picture on the top left, if you have your hands in that sort of position with your thumbs uppermost and pointing them down, so you're kind of angling almost straight here from the wrist to the thumb, that tends to be the fastest hand position. If you tilt your hand up so it's hitting a bit more wind, that doesn't tend to be quite as good. And again, for comfort, a lot of people often end up crossing them over, which I think is reasonable. But from when I was just chatting in the wind tunnel, it seems that for most people, most of the time, hands kind of close together and then pointing down in what we call ulnar deviation. So that's the technical term for tilting your wrist that way away from your thumb. That's generally the sort of faster position for your hands. Getting onto wheels, again, aerodynamics much more important than weight. You can obviously choose your wheels based on weight if you've got the option. You don't want the heavy ones, but you want the aerodynamic side of it. That generally means that disc wheels are the fastest. Obviously, that's why Wiggins is using them here for the hour record. That's why they're used on the velodrome, both front and rear, because disc wheels are faster. Simple. How much faster just depends on which disc and which wheel we're comparing them to. Now, obviously, in real world riding conditions, we can't use a front disc because pretty much all of us would fall off the bike with any crosswinds. But rear discs are tolerable for most people most of the time. And the reason that I say that is the reason that the depth of the front wheel makes so much more difference is that the forks can pivot right and left calmly. That's how we steer. So any crosswind turns into a turning moment on the front wheel. The back wheel is fixed into the chainstays and it's got the majority of our body weight on it, I would expect. So it can't cause as much of a sideways movement or a twist or even a fall from the bike. So I would, really sort of try to advise most people, even lighter riders, even on potentially slightly windy courses, to keep the disc wheel on. Not obviously extreme conditions, not the very lightest of rider, not on Kona, obviously, because they ban disc wheels anyway with the winds there. If it's a heavier rider, they'll tolerate it better. If they're more confident, they'll tolerate it better. What you'd be better doing, though, is going for a shallower front wheel to really give you confidence and improve the handling side of things, and still keep the disc on the back, for instance. So again, I'm not going to go into the data too much, but if you look at the two pictures on the right, the reason that deeper wheels are more aerodynamic is simply because of the depth of the rim of the wheel. So if you look at where I've drawn the lines on my bit of a sort of Tony Hart on the wheels there, I've drawn the blue lines. With a narrow wheel, the wind is becoming turbulent on that whole distance between the two inner portions of that rim. So if the wind is coming from the right, as soon as it starts to hit an edge, it becomes turbulent till it hits the back edge of the wheel. Now, if you look at the top, you can see the distance between the top line and the bottom line is a lot less. So the wind traveling over the rim, which is now a lot wider, is a lot less turbulent. So that wheel just has to be more aerodynamic. Then you can get into what the different manufacturers have, and the different handling properties, the dimples on the wheel and all that. And there might be marginal gains to be had there, but just going for deeper wheels is pretty much always more aerodynamic. That's the first thing to say. And how much by is difficult here. There's just, one example of moving from the blue line at the top, which is a standard sort of spoked rim wheel. So just, what you get on a cheap bike. You then move it to this brand's climbing wheel, which is a little better. You then go to the green line, which is a 60 mil rim, and that's better. The 90, not much different till you get to a higher yaw angle. So you get more of a side wind, and then the deeper rim starts to help you a little bit. And then the blue line, which is the disc, which again outperforms them all. And interestingly, in a side wind kind of more than 10, about 12 degrees, it actually acts a bit like a sail. It pushes you forward. So not only does it reduce drag, it kind of gives you positive drag in that sense, in that some wind conditions, a disc wheel can actually have almost like a bit of a propulsive force, which other wheels never get to that. So again, discs, definitely consider a disc for the back of your bike. Now, if we think about the other part of the wheel, the tires, as I mentioned, the thing we need to consider ourselves here is the resistance between the tire and the floor. So it's that contact patch, that rolling patch on the tire that comes into contact with the floor. Obviously, that the resistance, or like the friction, if you imagine it, it's influenced by the material in the rubber. You'll see brands saying they've got graphene in and some other products which can reduce the resistance. The diameter of the wheel. So the tendency now is to go for 25 mil tires, maybe 28 mil tires, and they have lower rolling resistance over the old standard, which were 19s or 21s, these real narrow. And it's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think narrower is going to be less. But generally, as far as rolling resistance is concerned, a smaller, wider patch on the floor is better than a longer, narrower patch on the floor. It will also be affected by the road surface. So rougher road surfaces cause more friction and vibration, and therefore slow you down more. The temperature, warmer temperatures are better. So that's the temperature of the rubber, the temperature of the floor. And again, it's another reason we race faster naturally in the summer and when we go abroad. And then again, another one that's not always that apparent is what you've got inside your tire affects the way that it rolls. So your choice of inner tubes, or whether you go tubeless, makes a difference as well. Now, the flip side of this is you can go too far and make your tyres much more puncture prone. And then unfortunately, you might have to slow down to fix a puncture, which hasn't really helped you. I'll not go through too many of these figures, but these are the figures that show you what you can save. In the first instance there, by swapping from a standard black inner tube to a latex one, which are often the most common brands are pink and blue, and they're just a very soft rubber compound. They could save you about 7 or 8 watts for a pair of wheels. If you go to sealant again and put the standard 30 mils in, then it's similar to that. So a latex tube and sealant is about the same, unless you're overzealous with the sealant, or the mechanic is and squirts a load in, and then it actually is unfortunately going to slow you down a bit. This is some of the common tyre brands. What I'll do is I'll put this in a PDF document and share it with you so you can look at some of the figures in your own time, and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. Tyres can make a massive difference. I've just on the blue arrows, I've put what I think are some of more common choices. So the top blue arrow is a Conti GP 4000, which was seen as one of the best all-rounder tyres. For a pair of wheels, they will take you about 34 watts to spin them up. If we go down to the bottom end of the graph, to some of the lowest ones, which are quite common in time trial racing, we go to the Vittoria Corsa Speed and the tubeless version, which is the bottom in a 25 mil. It only takes 21 watts to spin those up to 40 odd k's an hour. So even from a decent set of tires to the very best set of tires, you could be looking at a 12 watt saving. So again, I'm not saying you go right that end, because unfortunately you are more likely to suffer a puncture, but you might want to consider it. And then the ones in the middle of the newer GP 5000s, which kind of you might decide that's where I go for, because it's got some puncture protection, but they roll pretty quick as well. Tires, I say, really, really worth considering. And again, a bit more data. Left-hand side is a comparison of the different inner tubes on their own, and the right-hand side is a comparison of the different amounts of sealant that you put in your tyre and how that affects rolling resistance. Again, not going to go through it now, but you're very welcome to look it through at a later date. The other thing we need to be aware of is, I think a lot of us still put too much pressure in our tyres. If we're not up to date with this research, it's very common for people to just put more pressure in, thinking naturally that a harder tyre that kind of skims or bounces across the road surface has got to be faster than kind of a baggy sort of tyre that adapts and kind of gets into all the nooks and crannies in the road surface. But it isn't the case. Vibration is lost energy. So you actually want a tyre that adapts to the road surface. So lower pressures are generally faster, and the wider tyres, these new 25s, 28s, they are able to run at lower pressures and still run really, really well. So that's the way that things are going. Lighter riders definitely can go even lower. If it's rougher roads, you should probably take a bit out. If it's wet conditions, you take a bit out. And there are calculators for this online, various ones that need different amounts of information. But for instance, at me, at just under 75 kilos, most of the calculators come out of my tyre pressures being around about 80 psi. So just again, as a bit of a guide there. The penalty is less for being under, so long as you don't get a pinch flat, so long as you don't put so little in that you hit a little rock or stone or a curb or something, and it just flats the tyre straight away. Less pressure will penalise you less in rolling resistance terms than going over the top. So if you're supposed to be 80 and you run 78 or 82, 82 is going to be worse for you than 78, even though they're both only 2 psi out. So definitely worth keeping that in mind. Try the calculators and just get a rough idea of what you should be running. If you don't trust your track pump, you can also get a digital tyre pressure monitor for about 30-40 quid, which hopefully is a bit more accurate. So chains, pretty much the last one. As far as the bike's concerned, the main thing is that we look after the chain and check for wear, check that the length is still appropriate, and also clean it regularly. If it's just a simple dry ride, with a bit of dust, you could just wipe it down with a dry rag and then put your lube back on again. If it's been a wet ride or something really particularly grimy, you might want to degrease it and do a more thorough job. But yeah, we can't afford to let it get into a really bad state of play. New chains tend to come with a on them, but a new chain lubricant is to preserve the chain. It's not for low drag or low friction. It's to preserve the chain in the packaging. So if you buy a new chain yourself and not getting it from the bike shop, it should be degreased thoroughly when you get it, and then apply a lubricant for use on the bike. Now, this is where we can get into the weeds with which lubricants are better. You can pay, like the photo shows in Watch Shop do these dirty fast chains. Our friendly coaching colleague Hamo does his marginal chains, and it's all based on the fact that dry waxes now tend to be faster, tend to have lower friction than things like wet lubes and oils and the things that we used in the past. The good thing for us as consumers who are perhaps not technically adept is that some of the newer products like Squirt Lube and UFO Drip that we can do at home, they are essentially a dry wax that is sort of suspended in a solvent, and so they go on from a bottle, but then the solvent sort of dries up in the air and you're left with the wax on the chain. That is almost as good as these thorough preparations. It's not quite, but it's getting most of the way and is easy for you to use. So you can definitely now and again treat yourself to a nicely, brand new prepared chain. Hamo will do them for you, particularly, but you can do some of that most of the year yourself as well if you want to, with very little difficulty. And then the final component of the drivetrain is the chain rings, the jockey wheels, the chain line. And again, there's some savings to be had here. If you can keep the chain line straight when you're riding, you'll lose a little bit less power. If you can ask the chain not to quite kink so much as it's going around the jockey wheels and the chain wheels. So bigger chain rings on the front, bigger jockey wheels on the back will again perhaps have some marginal benefits, but particularly as far as the jockey wheels go, it's a lot of investment for a very small return. So yes, if you like the look of them, you want the latest kit, you might even get the little cover that goes on it now for another 800 quid. But I would look at other areas before you do this, and we can talk about upgrading chain rings as a separate thing, really looking at the sort of gear ratios and power profile, but that falls outside of this really. And the final one for the triathletes is, if we don't want to see things like this, this is obviously an image that I've chosen because it looks quite awful. All those gels and bento box strapped to the bike a bit willy-nilly. We've got round bottles on the down tube and the seat tube. We've got another couple of bottles on the back sitting vertical. So they're really some bad choices. Now, if we want to look to improve it, obviously a lot of our bikes now have integrated storage, which is amazing. If they're not, we've got some very good sort of aftermarket options now, which can actually, in some cases, again, some of it's marketing, but if you read the marketing, it can make your bike faster or less draggy with the component than without it. The middle picture there on the Scott shows the Drag 2.0 sort of custom printed little toolbox, and that fills in that area above the bottom bracket, which again is said to save you about 5 watts than if you don't have it. The little aero bottle there, the elite one with the dimples, again, that's a very common choice for guys. It's not necessarily more aerodynamic, it's going to be less aerodynamic, but it's much more aerodynamic than a round bottle, and I've got some figures on that now to come up with. I think the main thing that I would say is all of these options need to mean that the rider doesn't have to move as little as possible to eat and drink over the course of a race. Whether they are more or less aerodynamic is still quite important, but if you can hold your TT bars and eat or drink and not move for longer, you're going to stay more aero, and you are the biggest factor, like we said before. Again, a little bit more data just to back that up, and you can see one of the Watch Shop or like Ribble Well type riders using the between the aero bars bottle there, and he's resting his chin on it. That's probably a very good option if he only needs the odd swig. As you'll see from the figures on the left, which again, I'm not going to go through in any great detail, the best options is the third one down, which is a down tube aero bottle like the one we just mentioned. You further down, if you put a 500 ml, so a small bottle behind the saddle, and if it's a bit more sort of horizontal rather than vertical, that's a low drag position. And then again, like the rider in the picture, a between the arms 500 ml bottle doesn't add much to your aerodynamic drag as well. So if you are looking just to make some simple changes, those would be the 3 sort of areas to think about putting your hydration on your bike. And these were just for a bit of a joke, really. If you did all of these little things, which are probably not worth the effort, although those skewers I've actually got, and they just mean that they're not quick release. So basically, it means that nobody can just pinch your wheel and run off. But if you do all these little things that you sometimes hear about people doing, these are all like so-called 1 watters, where you could improve 1 watt and save 1 watt. And therefore, if you want to go and do them all, you might have 10 watts more saving. I did test the drinking straw one on my Scott bike. So with the drinking straw in and out was 1 watt difference. So obviously we need to drink. So I think we can accept that there's no penalty really for having a drinking straw in a front mounted bottle. Okay, I think I might call it quits there unless people are keen to carry on. My last probably 15 minutes is on race prep and sort of strategizing how to ride the course fast. So let's just take some questions on that, and then we can perhaps make a decision as to whether we carry on or call it there. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the, I'll look through what we've got already. Do you have numbers? Oh, let's go back. Yeah, no pins, numbers. Yeah, we've done that. Do you have numbers on how shaved legs impact your race pace? I like the Lanzarote full comparison also. No, these are all quite variable. You know, theoretically, I don't know if you saw Dan Bigham on the Danish guys in the track pursuit, where he put some K-tape down either side of their shins, and obviously pretending it's for like injury purposes, but it was just to act as a trip strip on the skin, because they're not allowed to use that sort of thing in the world champs on the track. Again, I think it's a bit of sort of a placebo thing, I think. But this is different on everybody. So you'll see some data where somebody with a beard is actually faster in the velodrome, in the wind tunnel, than without, and blah, blah, blah. So no, we can't say for sure, but if you shaving your legs cannot make you worse, basically. So I would plus, again, it's one of the things, does it look cool? Show you tan off and the veins in your legs a bit better. Do you need a new bike fit if you replace your aero bars? It depends how much you're changing things and how much you want to know whether you can then change your position even better. Bike fitting is the one expense I would repeat and not just do it once and think that it's done forever. Unfortunately, if you move anything or change anything by a new component, it's likely that you'd benefit from another bike fit at that point. I would say not essential, but definitely you could probably benefit from it. Tire pressure we've done, as in I can't give exacts, except lower on wider tires is generally better. Use the calculator because you can put in your variables. You can give a rough idea of the road surface, the weather, what your weight is with you in the bike, what tires you're using, and it will give you an estimate based on that. And that works pretty well. Yeah, so in the rear mounted bottle cage, obviously one that's more vertical is less likely to jettison your bottle out the back. One that's more horizontal or sort of oblique is more likely to jettison it about the back. By far the best bottle cages are the Gorilla ones, the X-Lab Gorilla cages. They are definitely the hardest to get the bottle in and out of. And my other top tip is probably only go for a 500 ml bottle, so there's less weight in the end of the bottle if you imagine it sticking out of the cage. And don't use bottles that don't have a ridge midway up. So most of your bottles, like SIS, etc., they'll have like a natural indentation 2/3 of the way up the bottle, and as you push it in the cage you feel it click in. But there are other alternatives which are just pure cylinders. I've lost them millions of times before I realized why I was being a bit of an idiot. So yeah, Gorilla cages, maybe go for a more vertical bottle position if you're really worried. And then the other one was the bottles with a ridge around the sort of half to 2/3 of the way up. Good, Susan. If you're making mistakes, we can make big improvements. That's great. Yeah, you don't need a watch for your ride. Again, it's likely to be a 1 watt difference. It's such a small impact, like the straw, really. So if you want to wear your watch, I'd wear it and not worry about it. Arm warmers, I think it depends on whether you're putting something on that's designed to have like an effect on the airflow. Yes, if they're decent quality Lycra, and they're pulling your bingo wings in a bit, then you're likely to be a bit quicker. But for the time spent putting them on, so again, for a time trial, a long sleeve skin suit is probably a definite. In triathlon, the time, especially if you're a bit wet, trying to put arm warmers on of some sort, I would say probably not. But you could look at the merits of that yourself. Yeah, no, I knew Phil would say that. Yeah, so you don't need, obviously you only need a bike computer. If you don't really need a watch for the bike, but if we're a typical triathlete and want every split, including transition, I do understand, and I still do it. And I think, yeah, accept that there's probably a tiny penalty for having your watch on, and just get on with it.
It won't make you swim faster.
No.
Yeah, Phil, yeah, your call on whether you want to get into this, or is this actually even like part two?
Yeah, I could make this into a full hour in itself, probably.
Exactly. I think there's quite a lot in this. And I think really a lot of the guys that have been with us quite a good amount of time, this really is like, we could go more in depth here. And it's like the next step, basically. You've got your position really dialed in and you know the rest of it. Race prep and strategy, you know, we use best bike split with quite a lot of athletes now, don't we? And you know, starting to use that as an educational tool rather than hard and fast rules, but I think it helps. So.
Well, let's just finish. If anybody wants to come off mute and just ask a couple of questions or put any points across, I'll just stay here till you're finished. Otherwise, if you want to drop off the call, feel free. What I will do somehow, I'll try to circulate a PDF document of the slides so that you can at least review some of the facts and figures at a later date if you want to. The presentation itself will probably be available on YouTube, so you can rewatch it if you want to. But I think sometimes it's just nice to see the figures again when you can concentrate on them a little bit.
Yeah, brilliant, Phil. Really appreciate that tonight. You know, so in depth. I think a lot of the people have got so much from it. And look, everyone's still listening. You know, I'd just say, like, great to see so many people like turning up and valuing, like educating yourself better within the sport. I think it's so easy to just go, oh, well, I'll just follow my training plan and that'll make me better. But there's so much more to it. And yeah, it's good to show everyone paying an interest in their own development, basically. So yeah, cheers, Phil.
Yeah, it's great.
Hope your cough clears up.
Yeah, me too.
It's the next race, isn't it? Which one of us is better sooner? So
yeah.
At least no one can catch it off us over Zoom. Hey, so.
No.
Cheers. Right. Thanks, guys. Speak to you later.
Yeah. I'll just hang about till everybody's dropped off. So if anybody wants to chat, feel free.
Thanks, Phil.
All right, mate. See you later.
Cheers. Thank you.